The engine behind me erupted in flames, metal screaming against metal as my P-39 Airacobra shuddered through the humid New Guinea air. 27 Japanese Zeros had jumped us over Wewak, and now I was going down hard, the distinctive whine of my Allison V1710 engine replaced by the roar of fire and the whistle of wind through bullet holes. Below me stretched nothing but green hell, endless jungle canopy broken only by muddy rivers and the occasional glint of enemy positions. Shot down, surrounded, but not finished. My name is Lieutenant Jack Morrison, and this is the story of how I survived 3 days behind Japanese lines in New Guinea, armed with nothing but my service pistol, my wits, and eventually, a stolen enemy jeep that saved my life. It was October 15, 1943, and the war in the Pacific had been grinding on for nearly 2 years. Our squadron, the 35th Fighter Group, had been operating out of a hastily constructed airstrip near Port Moresby for 6 months, flying missions against Japanese positions along the northern coast of New Guinea. The P-39 Airacobra wasn't the most popular fighter in the Pacific. Most pilots would have preferred a P-38 Lightning or even a P-40 Warhawk. But the Airacobra was what we had, and we'd learned to make it work. The P-39 was an odd bird, I'll give you that. Unlike every other fighter plane in the world, its engine sat behind the pilot, connected to the propeller by a long drive shaft that ran between your legs. This gave it a distinctive look and an even more distinctive sound, a deep, throaty growl that Japanese pilots had learned to recognize from miles away. The engine placement also meant the plane's center of gravity was different from what most pilots were used to. It could be tricky in a fight, but it also made the P-39 surprisingly maneuverable at low altitude. That morning, 12 of us had taken off in the pre-dawn darkness, our Airacobras loaded with fuel and ammunition for what intelligence said would be a routine patrol. In the Pacific theater, there was no such thing as routine. The Japanese controlled most of northern New Guinea, and their pilots were experienced, aggressive, and flying some of the best fighter planes in the world. I was flying wing position to Captain Bill Henderson, a veteran with 14 confirmed kills who'd been in the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. We'd crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains as the sun came up, painting the jungle canopy below us in shades of green and gold. The weather was typical for New Guinea, hot, humid, with towering cumulus clouds building up for the daily afternoon thunderstorms. Red flight. This is Red Leader. Henderson's voice crackled in my headphones. Intelligence reports heavy Japanese air activity near Wewak. Keep your eyes open and your throttles ready. Wewak was a major Japanese air base on the northern coast, home to hundreds of enemy aircraft. We'd hit it before, but the Japanese always seemed to have more planes than we could destroy. Today was supposed to be different. Our mission was to provide high cover for a formation of B-25 Mitchell bombers that would be hitting Japanese shipping in Wewak Harbor. But as we approached the target area, flying at 18,000 feet, there were no bombers in sight. Red Leader, this is Red 3, called out Lieutenant Dave Walsh over the radio. I don't see our big friends anywhere. Henderson's voice came back tense. Roger, Red 3. Intel must have screwed up the timing again. We'll orbit the area, and that's when all hell broke loose. They came out of the sun, 27 Japanese Zeros in perfect formation, diving down on us with the advantage of altitude and surprise. The Zero was everything the P-39 wasn't: light, nimble, able to climb like a homesick angel and turn on a dime. But we had advantages too. The Airacobra was faster in a dive, more heavily armed, and built like a tank compared to the fragile Japanese fighters. Bandits. Bandits high, Henderson shouted into his radio. Red flight, break right and dive. I yanked my stick hard over and pushed the nose down, feeling the familiar shudder as my P-39 accelerated toward the deck. Behind me, I could hear the distinctive chatter of machine gun fire as the first Zeros made their attack run. Tracer rounds streaked past my canopy like deadly fireworks. The next few minutes were pure chaos. 12 American fighters and 27 Japanese Zeros twisted and turned through the sky above the New Guinea jungle, leaving trails of smoke and fire in their wake. I got on the tail of one Zero and gave him a burst from my 37mm cannon, the P-39's main armament that fired right through the propeller hub. The big shells tore through the Zero's thin fuselage like paper, and the Japanese fighter disintegrated in a ball of orange flame. But there were too many of them. As I pulled up from my attack, 2 more Zeros latched onto my tail, their 20mm cannon shells walking up toward my aircraft. I threw the P-39 into a violent barrel roll, using the plane's unusual handling characteristics to throw off their aim. The maneuver worked for about 10 seconds. That's when the third Zero, coming in from my blind spot, opened fire. I felt the impacts before I heard them. Heavy thuds as cannon shells punched through my engine compartment. The Allison V-1710 behind me coughed once, twice, then began to run rough. Oil pressure was dropping fast, and I could smell smoke starting to seep into the cockpit. Red 2 is hit, I called over the radio. Engine smoking, losing oil pressure. Get out of there, Morrison. Henderson shouted back, head for home. But home was 150 miles away across some of the most hostile territory on Earth. My engine temperature gauge was climbing into the red, and the smoke was getting thicker. I had maybe 5 minutes before the engine seized completely. I nosed down toward the jungle, looking for anywhere that might serve as a landing strip. The problem with New Guinea was that it was almost solid jungle, endless miles of trees, vines, and swamps broken only by a few rivers and the occasional native village. Landing a damaged fighter plane in that green hell was like trying to thread a needle while riding a bucking horse. The engine finally quit completely as I crossed a muddy river about 60 miles behind Japanese lines. The sudden silence was deafening after hours of engine noise. Now all I could hear was the whistle of wind past my canopy, and the distant sound of the air battles still raging behind me. My airspeed was dropping fast, and the jungle was rushing up to meet me. I spotted what looked like a small clearing ahead, maybe 200 yards long, and barely wide enough for my wingspan. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I lined up on final approach, lowering my landing gear and praying the P-39's tough construction would see me through. The touchdown was harder than any carrier landing I'd ever seen. The Airacobra hit the soft ground and bounced twice before settling in, the landing gear immediately sinking into the muddy earth. I stood on the brakes, feeling the plane slow down, but I was running out of clearing fast. Dead ahead, a wall of trees grew larger and larger in my windscreen. At the last second, I yanked the stick back and kicked the right rudder. The P-39 ground looped, spinning around in a cloud of mud and torn vegetation before finally coming to rest with its nose pointing back the way I'd come. The engine behind me was hissing and crackling as hot metal cooled in the humid air. I sat there for a moment, hardly believing I was still alive. My hands were shaking as I unbuckled my harness and opened the canopy. The smell of the jungle hit me immediately, thick, humid air heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation and exotic flowers. Birds were calling from the trees around my makeshift landing strip, and I could hear insects buzzing in the undergrowth. But I couldn't afford to sit and admire the local wildlife. I was deep behind enemy lines, and it wouldn't be long before Japanese patrols came to investigate the crash site. I grabbed my survival kit, my service pistol, and what was left of my water, then climbed out of the cockpit. The P-39 looked like it had been through a blender. Cannon shells had punched holes all through the engine compartment, and one of the main landing gear struts was bent at an impossible angle. She'd never fly again, but she'd gotten me down alive, and that was all I could ask for. I took a moment to orient myself. According to my map, the nearest Allied positions were about 90 miles to the south, across some of the worst terrain in the Pacific. But I'd trained for this possibility. Every pilot in the theater carried survival gear and had been briefed on evasion procedures. The key was to keep moving, avoid contact with the enemy, and try to link up with friendly forces or native tribes who might help an Allied airman. The first day was the hardest. I'd never experienced anything like the New Guinea jungle. The heat was oppressive, over 100 degrees with humidity that felt like breathing through a wet blanket. The undergrowth was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Vines caught at my flight suit, thorns tore at my hands, and every few minutes I had to stop and hack through a wall of vegetation with my survival knife. The sounds were incredible: birds calling, monkeys chattering, insects buzzing and clicking in a constant symphony of jungle noise. But underneath it all, I kept listening for human sounds, the sound of Japanese patrols searching for me. I didn't have to wait long. Around midday, as I was struggling through a particularly dense patch of jungle, I heard voices calling in Japanese. They were maybe a quarter mile behind me, but getting closer. I froze, trying to make myself invisible in the green twilight under the jungle canopy. The voices grew louder, and I could hear the sound of men pushing through the underbrush. They were following my trail, the broken branches and disturbed vegetation I'd left behind in my desperate flight from the crash site. I had to move faster, but every step seemed to make noise in the humid stillness. That's when I had my first stroke of luck. I stumbled across a small stream, maybe 3 feet wide and knee-deep, flowing roughly southwest, toward Allied lines. The water was cool and clear, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. More importantly, it would hide my trail from the Japanese search party. I waded downstream for over an hour, trying not to think about what might be living in the water with me. New Guinea was home to crocodiles, poisonous snakes, and things I probably didn't want to know about. But it was better than being captured by the Japanese. As the sun began to set, painting the jungle canopy in shades of gold and red, I found a place to hide for the night, a fallen tree with a hollow underneath where I could squeeze in and remain hidden. I ate some of my emergency rations and tried to get some sleep, but the jungle never really went quiet. All night long, I could hear things moving in the darkness, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and strange calls that might have been birds or might have been something else entirely. The second day was when I made my first real mistake. I'd been moving southwest all morning, following a native trail that seemed to be heading in the right direction. The trail made travel much easier than pushing through the raw jungle, and I was making good time. That should have been my first warning. The trail led to a small native village, maybe a dozen huts built on stilts, with cultivated gardens and what looked like a small airstrip carved out of the jungle nearby. It looked deserted at first, and I was desperate for food and water. My emergency rations were running low, and the heat was sapping my strength. I was approaching the nearest hut when I heard the sound of a vehicle engine. A Japanese jeep was coming up the trail behind me, moving fast through the jungle. I could hear voices shouting in Japanese and the sound of equipment rattling. I was caught in the open with nowhere to hide except the village itself. I sprinted for the nearest hut and dove underneath it just as the jeep roared into the village clearing. Through the bamboo slats of the hut's floor, I could see Japanese boots walking around directly above my head. There were at least 4 soldiers, maybe more, talking rapidly in Japanese. One of them seemed to be giving orders. They were conducting a search of the village, looking for me or for any sign that the natives had been helping Allied personnel. I could hear them kicking through the huts above, overturning furniture and supplies. One soldier walked directly over my hiding spot, his boots making the bamboo floor creak ominously. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the soldiers climbed back into their jeep and drove away. But they'd left one man behind, a sentry posted at the edge of the village to watch for any sign of Allied activity. I was trapped. The sentry was positioned where he could see anyone approaching or leaving the village. He had a clear field of fire across the entire clearing, and there was no way I could slip past him without being spotted. I'd have to wait until dark and hope I could sneak around him. As the afternoon wore on, I watched the sentry through the gaps in the bamboo flooring. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, with the lean build of a veteran jungle fighter. He carried an Airacobra rifle and had a full field pack, which meant he was probably planning to stay in position overnight. That's when I got my second stroke of luck, though it didn't seem like luck at the time. Around 4 o'clock, the sentry heard something in the jungle and went to investigate. I could see him moving carefully through the undergrowth, rifle at the ready, following some sound I couldn't hear from my hiding place. He was gone for maybe 10 minutes, but when he came back, he wasn't alone. 3 native men were with him, their hands tied behind their backs. The sentry was pushing them roughly toward the center of the village, clearly planning to interrogate them about Allied activity in the area. The natives looked terrified, and that's when I realized I couldn't just hide and watch. These people hadn't done anything except live in the wrong place at the wrong time. If the Japanese soldier thought they were helping Allied personnel, their lives were forfeit. The Japanese military had a brutal reputation for dealing with native populations they suspected of aiding the enemy. I made a decision that probably saved my life, though it could easily have gotten me killed. I crawled out from under the hut and circled around behind the sentry's position. He was focused on his prisoners, trying to question them in broken English mixed with Japanese. The natives clearly didn't understand what he wanted, which was only making him more frustrated and dangerous. My service pistol was a .45 caliber Colt model 1911, standard issue for American pilots. It was reliable, accurate at short range, and packed enough punch to drop a man with one shot. But using it meant giving away my position to any other Japanese forces in the area. I didn't have a choice. The sentry was getting more agitated by the minute, and I could see him working himself up to do something terrible to the prisoners. I worked my way around until I was maybe 30 yards behind him, then stepped out of the jungle with my pistol raised. "Hey!" I shouted. The Japanese soldier spun around, bringing his rifle up, but he was too slow. My first shot took him in the chest, spinning him around. My second shot finished the job. The sound of the gunshots echoed through the jungle like thunder, and birds exploded from the trees in all directions. The 3 natives stared at me in amazement as I cut their bonds with my survival knife. None of them spoke English, but their gratitude was obvious. One of them, an older man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, gestured toward the jungle and said something in what I assumed was the local language. I pointed to myself and said, "American." Then I pointed south and said, "Allies." The old man nodded and spoke rapidly to the other 2. They had a quick conversation in their own language. Then the old man turned back to me and nodded again. They were going to help me. What happened next probably saved my life. The old man led me to the Japanese jeep the sentry had been guarding. It was a Type 95 Kurogane, a small, 4-wheel drive vehicle that the Japanese used for reconnaissance and simply runs through difficult terrain. More importantly, it had a full tank of gas and enough supplies to get me back to Allied lines. The old native gestured toward the jeep, then toward the south. He said something I didn't understand, but his meaning was clear: take the jeep and go. But first, he indicated they needed to hide the evidence of what had happened here. Working together, we dragged the dead sentry's body into the jungle and covered it with fallen leaves and branches. The natives scattered the signs of the struggle and made it look like the sentry had simply abandoned his post. With any luck, it would be days before other Japanese forces realized what had happened. The old man drew a rough map in the dirt, showing me a trail that led southwest toward Allied positions. He pointed to several spots along the route and made warning gestures, Japanese checkpoints or patrol areas I should avoid. Then he pointed to a spot about 60 miles away and smiled. "Americans," he said in heavily accented English. I shook hands with all 3 men, wishing I could do more to thank them for risking their lives to help me. Then I climbed into the Japanese jeep and started the engine. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was escaping from the Japanese in one of their own vehicles. The Type 95 Kurogane was actually a pretty good little vehicle for jungle warfare. It was small enough to navigate narrow trails, had excellent ground clearance, and was mechanically simple enough to keep running under harsh conditions. The Japanese had designed it specifically for operations in places like New Guinea, and it showed. I drove through the night, following the native trail by moonlight and stopping frequently to listen for sounds of other vehicles or patrols. The jungle was full of night sounds, birds, insects, and things I couldn't identify, but I didn't hear any human activity. As dawn broke on my third day behind enemy lines, I was getting close to the position the old native had marked as American. The terrain was becoming more familiar. I recognized some of the landscape features from our pre-mission briefings. But I was also getting into an area where American patrols might shoot first and ask questions later. That's when I saw the P-40 Warhawk. It was flying low over the jungle canopy, maybe 1,000 feet up, following what looked like a regular patrol pattern. American planes didn't usually fly along this deep in contested territory, which meant there were probably ground forces nearby. I stopped the Jeep and got out, looking for some way to signal the aircraft. I found what I needed in the Jeep supply kit, a signal mirror that the Japanese used for communication with their own aircraft. I caught the morning sun with the mirror and began flashing the standard American identification signal, ... SOS in Morse code. The P-40 pilot saw my signals and circled back, waggling his wings to acknowledge. Then he flew off toward the south, presumably to report my position to friendly ground forces. I climbed back into the Jeep and continued driving, hoping I wouldn't get shot by nervous American sentries who might not expect to see a lone Japanese vehicle approaching their lines. 20 minutes later, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, American voices calling in English through the jungle ahead of me. I stopped the Jeep, stood up, and shouted as loud as I could, "American pilot! Don't shoot! American pilot coming in!" The patrol that found me was a squad of Marines from the 1st Marine Division. They'd been alerted by the P-40 pilot's radio call and had come out to investigate. Their sergeant, a tough-looking veteran with 3 stripes and a face like leather, approached the Jeep with his Thompson submachine gun at the ready. "What's the password, flyboy?" he called out. I gave him the day's authentication code, which I'd memorized before taking off 3 days earlier. The sergeant relaxed and slung his weapon. "Lieutenant Jack Morrison, 35th Fighter Group," I told him. "Shot down October 15th over Wewak." "Well, I'll be damned," the sergeant said, looking at the Japanese Jeep. "You've got some story to tell, Lieutenant. Command's been looking for you for 3 days. The ride back to Allied lines took another 2 hours through jungle trails I never could have navigated on foot. The Marine Patrol filled me in on what had happened after I was shot down. The air battle over Wewak had been a major victory for American forces. We'd destroyed 18 Japanese aircraft for the loss of only 3 P-39s. Captain Henderson had made it back safely and had been leading search efforts for the missing pilots. But the real victory, the Marines told me, was strategic. The heavy Japanese losses in the air battle had forced them to withdraw most of their remaining aircraft from Wewak to bases farther north. American bombers were now hitting Japanese positions along the coast almost unopposed, and ground forces were preparing for the next phase of the New Guinea campaign. When we finally reached the main American base, I was debriefed by intelligence officers who were very interested in everything I'd observed behind enemy lines. The information about Japanese patrol patterns, the location of the airstrip near the native village, and the strength of enemy forces in the area would all be valuable for future operations. But more than that, my experience highlighted something important about the war in the Pacific. This wasn't just a conflict between American and Japanese forces. The native populations of these islands were caught in the middle, and many of them were willing to risk their lives to help Allied personnel. Their courage and sacrifice were just as important as anything we did in the cockpit of a fighter plane. 3 weeks later, I was back in the cockpit of another P-39 Airacobra, flying missions over the same jungle where I'd spent 3 desperate days on the ground. The war in the Pacific still had almost 2 years to run, but by late 1943, the tide was clearly turning in America's favor. Every air battle, every successful mission, every pilot who made it home brought us one step closer to victory. The Japanese Jeep I'd borrowed became something of a legend around our base. Intelligence had it shipped back to Australia for study, but not before every pilot in the squadron had gotten their picture taken with it. We called it the Morrison Special, and it became a symbol of American ingenuity and determination. Looking back on those 3 days behind enemy lines, I realize how lucky I was. Lucky that my P-39 held together long enough to get me to the ground alive. Lucky that I found that stream to hide my trail. Lucky that I stumbled across native allies who were willing to help. And lucky that a Japanese sentry had abandoned his jeep in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. But luck only takes you so far. The real lesson of my experience was that survival in combat depends on training, determination, and the willingness to take calculated risks when you have to. The American military had prepared me for the possibility of being shot down behind enemy lines, and that preparation saved my life. More importantly, it had given me the confidence to help those native prisoners when their lives were in danger. The war in the Pacific would claim hundreds of thousands of lives before it was over, but every individual story of survival, courage, and sacrifice mattered. Every pilot who made it home, every Marine who took another beachhead, every sailor who kept the supply lines open was contributing to the ultimate victory over Japanese militarism. By the time the war ended in August 1945, American forces had pushed the Japanese all the way back to their home islands. The industrial might of the United States, combined with the courage and determination of American servicemen and the support of native populations throughout the Pacific, had proven too much for the Japanese Empire to overcome. The P-39 Airacobra, despite its quirks and limitations, had played its part in that victory. Today, more than 80 years later, few people remember the P-39 or the battles it fought over the jungles of New Guinea. But for those of us who flew them, those ungainly fighters with their engines behind the cockpit were the difference between life and death, between freedom and defeat, between coming home and disappearing forever into the green hell of the Pacific jungle. I learned something important during those 3 days behind enemy lines. War is about more than machines and tactics and strategy. It's about individual human beings making split-second decisions under impossible pressure. It's about native villagers risking their lives to help a downed American pilot. It's about a young Marine sergeant who could have shot first and asked questions later, but chose to follow proper procedure instead. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's about a shot-down pilot who finds himself driving a stolen Japanese jeep through the jungle at dawn, racing toward freedom and carrying with him a story that proves that in war, as in life, anything is possible if you're willing to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless. The cost of victory in the Pacific was enormous: hundreds of thousands of American casualties, entire island populations displaced or killed, and destruction on a scale the world had never seen before. But the alternative was unthinkable: a Japanese emperor that controlled half the Pacific and threatened the freedom of every nation in the region. My small part in that victory was just one story among millions, but it was my story, and it taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Whether you're flying a fighter plane into combat or hiding under a native hut while enemy soldiers search for you, the measure of a person isn't whether they're afraid, but what they do when they are afraid. That's the real legacy of World War II in the Pacific, not just the strategic victories or the technological achievements, but the countless individual acts of courage, sacrifice, and determination that made those victories possible. Every American who served in the Pacific theater has their own story to tell, and every one of those stories matters. Mine just happened to involve a very unusual road trip through the New Guinea jungle, courtesy of the Imperial Japanese Army. Lieutenant Jack Morrison flew 73 combat missions in the Pacific theater and was credited with 6 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, he returned to civilian life and worked as a commercial pilot for 30 years. He never forgot the 3 native men who helped him escape, and in 1985 he returned to New Guinea to try to find them and express his gratitude. While he was unable to locate the men themselves, he established a scholarship fund for native students that continues to operate today.